Welcome to Anand Menon from UK in a Changing Europe. You are a professor at King's College, but I think mostly now 100% devoted to this authoritative source on Brexit and I guess EU-UK relations as well. And we're very, very happy to have you this morning. We were discussing yesterday with Tim Bale the use of social media, and we actually realized that you were one of the first academics to use TikTok. So that I don't know if it's one of the tips for our PhD students who are joining us today, but we were talking about how to disseminate our research, and I think you're one of the example of academics that has managed to speak to the broader general public about issues which are usually just discussed amongst academics. So that's a great perspective. So I think the floor is yours. We have PhD students who are in different levels of their PhDs. A few are master's students, some have finished their PhD. And I think next to your talk about, the impact of Brexit on British politics and public policies and polity, maybe from an identity perspective, you have any comments? If you have any tips as well on for these young scholars on what is worth researching and how to conduct their research to make it also maybe available to the public or relevant for a bigger audience would be really, really nice. So the floor is yours.
Thank you, Sarah. Hi, everyone. I'm very happy to I'm going to talk for about 10 or 15 minutes, then we can have a discussion. So if you want to talk about dissemination, then that's absolutely fine. I'm sorry about my voice. So I've been asked to talk about the impact of Brexit on the UK. I mean, it's worth saying first and foremost that Brexit isn't over. I mean, it isn't over partly because we don't know if the protocol is going to collapse, in which case the impact of Brexit on the UK will be very different to if the protocol doesn't collapse. And we don't know how the trade and cooperation agreement will be implemented and whether they'll manage to implement it effectively. So the jury's out on a lot of areas. But I think in terms of three main areas, we can sort of speculate a little bit about the impact of Brexit on the UK. First, it will have a significant medium-term impact on the aggregate UK economy. I mean, it's worth just stressing this. I mean, there have been a rash of long-term forecasts done about the impact of Brexit. And the most interesting thing about those long-term forecasts is the fact that none of the organizations that did them have seen it fit to revisit their original findings. That's to say, all the economists that have done long-term forecasts still think their long-term forecasts were broadly correct. And, there's a range, as there always is with these things, but I'd say that what most of them argue is that over the medium term, say 10 to 15 years, the impact on the UK economy will be something in the order of 5 to 7% of GDP. This, remember, is growth foregone. No one's saying that the UK GDP will be 5 to 7% smaller in 10 or 15 years' time. What they're saying is it will be 5 to 7% smaller than it would have been had the UK stayed within the single market and the customs union. And there are various ways of sort of slicing and dicing these figures, but I suppose on average, what we're thinking about is a long-term hit to growth of about 0.5 to 1% annually. So by any metric, that's huge. If you want one metric, the estimate from the most recent set of forecasts that colleagues at the LSE did for us is that over 20 years, the impact of Brexit will be 2 to 3 times the impact of COVID on the UK economy. I mean, bear in mind, the impact of COVID is short and sharp. Most economists expect the UK and indeed most other economies to recover to pretty much pre-pandemic levels quite quickly. But there will be a long-term impact, but it'll be significantly shorter than the impact of Brexit. But one of the things that COVID does is it disguises the impact of Brexit. It disguises the impact of Brexit in a number of ways. Firstly, just in the noise of COVID, it's quite hard to spot the specific impact of Brexit. It's even harder to spot the specific impact of Brexit because many of those impacts cannot be felt while lockdown persists. So, for instance, there's very little on services trade in the trade and cooperation agreements. But of course, lawyers, architects, and academics are not able at the moment to travel to EU countries to ply their trade. So they haven't yet run into the constraints that will be implied in terms of needing to get visas or whatever. Roger Daltrey, who's been very keen to complain about Brexit, having supported it 5 years ago, hasn't been able to go touring continental Europe yet, so he doesn't yet realize fully that he's going to have to register his guitar and perhaps pay a fee to take it with him and deal with cabotage rules. That means if the Who go on tour, they can only stop in 2 places in the EU before having to come back under EU rules. So all those constraints, let alone the constraints on holidaymakers in terms of travel, are yet to be felt. And those constraints on holidaymakers will be pretty severe, because the first time you enter the EU from the United Kingdom, you've got to have your fingerprints and all other sorts of other data taken from you. And if you imagine that in the height of August at the Spanish border, there will be impacts yet to be felt. The other reason why, in a sense, we haven't yet experienced the full impact of Brexit is that the British government hasn't implemented Brexit yet. Remember, while the EU has put in place the full suite of checks on UK exports to the European Union, goods from the European Union are traveling as if there is no border still, because the UK government has not put the infrastructure in place, which is weird in a way for a project that was partly justified in terms of balance of payments, that EU exporters can export to the UK as if we were still in the single market and the customs union. UK exporters cannot export to the European Union because their goods are facing checks at the borders. So it's a lot harder to trade from the UK to the EU than the other way around. But the crucial point, I think, about the economics of COVID is the politics of the economics of COVID. And partly because of COVID, and partly because of the nature of the Brexit impact itself, it's very hard to identify what Brexit is doing to the UK economy. Growth foregone is quite easy to spot if you happen to be the sort of person that reads the economic sections of the Financial Times and sees, for instance, comparative growth charts between the EU and the United Kingdom. But if you're an ordinary citizen going about your day-to-day business, that immediate impact of Brexit is very, very hard to spot. One of the problems about the debate about Brexit was there was a lot of fuss made about this idea of a cliff edge, that Brexit would lead to an economic cliff edge. And Remainers tended to say, oh, after the referendum, there'll be a cliff edge. After transition ends, there'll be a cliff edge. After COVID, there will be a cliff edge. There will be no cliff edge. If you want an analogy for Brexit, it is a slow puncture. I mean, for those of you who cycle, what you'll know is if you get a slow puncture on your bike, there are 2 defining features of that. One, it takes you ages to realize that you've got it. You get a little bit slower every day. You sort of think it's age or rheumatism or arthritis or whatever it is. And it's only after a few weeks that you look at your tire and you realize that it's flat. Brexit will be like that. It'll take a long time to play out. It'll take a long time for firms to decide, actually, it's not worth our while trading with the EU anymore. The second thing about a slow puncture is once you've discovered you've got it, it's so long since you picked it up that you can no longer figure out where you got it. And that, I think, is the key political issue of Brexit, is even if, and this requires the EU's economy to perform well, even if in 10 or 15 years' time, we suddenly find ourselves on holiday in France thinking, God, these French people live well compared to us. Why is that? Why is their economy doing well and ours isn't? In 15 years' time, it won't be obvious that that's because of a referendum we held in 2016. There'll be all sorts of intervening variables. So for those people who are saying, okay, look, Leave voters will ultimately realize what they did to the UK economy, I don't think that's true. I don't think that narrative is going to be anywhere near as clear as some people claim. The second area of Brexit's impact on the UK is politics. What the referendum did was it reinforced, and if you like, turbocharged an alternative cleavage in British politics. British politics had been structured by class. It had been largely structured around that traditional left versus right economic values dimension of politics. That had been weakening, certainly. You see that with increased abstentionism, with the relative strength of the Lib Dems and UKIP, that there was a values element, a social values element to politics before the referendum, but that element became a lot stronger after the referendum, which is why the electoral geography of England in particular has shifted quite decisively since the referendum. The Conservative Party is now a Leave coalition. 82% of the people who voted for Boris Johnson in December 2019 had voted Leave. And what that means is, whilst the Conservative Party is relatively united on social values, so they could talk about immigration or footballers taking the knee or the toppling of statues or Brexit, and they all remain quite happy because they're all on the same page. Because that is a cross-class coalition, if you think about it, the Tory party voters are now the traditional Tories of the Shires, plus those former Labour voters in the post-industrial red wall seats. The problem the Conservatives have is they are profoundly divided over economic policy. For Labour, absolutely the opposite is the case. The Labour Party, like so many social democratic movements across Europe, is profoundly divided over values. You have sort of social liberals in their metropolitan heartlands, social conservatives in their traditional working class heartlands. That is one of the reasons why Keir Starmer will never say the word Brexit, because he understands that his party's coalition is split down the middle on social values questions. The Labour Party, however, is very cohesive and very much on a page with its members and its supporters and its voters when it comes to economics. So one of the big battles in British politics will be about what politics is about. Is it about culture or is it about economics? If it's about economics, the Tories will be in trouble. If it's about culture, Labour will struggle. And finally on the politics, one of the massive paradoxes of Brexit is, if you think back to the Maastricht Treaty, when the original Tory Eurosceptics were making the case about why we should leave the European Union, the case was that Brussels was over-regulating. Brussels was some kind of left-wing French plot to shackle the UK economy with a whole load of unnecessary rules. And if only we left, we could scrap those rules. We could become a nimble, agile, properly capitalist economy and outcompete the Europeans. By the time a Conservative Prime Minister was actually negotiating Brexit in 2020, he threatened to walk away from the talks because EU negotiating demands meant the British government could not give as much state aid as it wanted to. So Boris Johnson was complaining in 2020 about the fact he wanted to make the UK more German rather than less German, and wanted to spend more money intervening in the economy than the EU would allow him to. And this paradox is the fact that the economic ideology of Brexit has almost done a complete U-turn. From being a project about deregulation in the face of over-regulation by Brussels, Brexit is now a way of allowing the state to intervene more in the economy than it could have done had we been within the European Union. So in a sense, if you look at that Tory electoral coalition, you look at the nature of their MPs in Parliament, that dream that people like David Davis had back in the early 1990s, that we would use leaving the European Union as an opportunity to strip regulations away from our economy, that simply will not happen, because the Conservative Party does not have a coherent majority in favour of those very sort of traditionally Thatcherite approaches to economics. And the final thing very quickly on the impact of Brexit is constitutional. You've got someone, I think, talking later on about the Northern Ireland Protocol. It's just worth saying, I think, that Brexit has disturbed public opinion, not only in Northern Ireland, but also in Scotland and to a significant extent, though we never talk about it, Wales as well. We've seen for a period of about a year or so, a steady majority in favour of independence in Scotland for the first time ever. And this is partly a result of that referendum and its aftermath. So the fabric of the United Kingdom is being challenged by the aftermath of Brexit. And, you know, above and beyond the questions of independence and the breakup of the United Kingdom, which is far from a given, by the way, there is also the fact that the devolution settlement itself has had to be reworked, because devolution to Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland was dependent on membership of the European Union. Membership of the European Union meant that Scotland could have its own rights and privileges when it came to agricultural policy, but it didn't matter because the whole country was in the single market and the customs union. And the reason why the UK government felt it had to introduce the Internal Market Bill, which caused so much argument at the time, and is in many ways a power grab back from the devolved governments, was because outside the European Union, if the Scots have their own agricultural policy, there would need to be checks between Scotland and England on agricultural produce. So the workings of the UK system have been shifted by Brexit. And the final point I'll make is the other way, and we don't talk about this enough, the other way in which our constitution has been affected by Brexit is this. There is no mechanism under the UK political system to enshrine rights beyond the reach of Parliament. What in many systems is called constitutional law doesn't really exist in the United Kingdom because Parliament is sovereign. We have, in the famous phrase, an elective dictatorship. Whatever Parliament decides to do, it can do by a simple majority. That wasn't the case when we were members of the European Union because EU law was beyond the reach of the UK Parliament acting in isolation. So what that meant was, if you had workers' rights or environmental standards or anything like that agreed at the EU level, it served in the United Kingdom as a kind of quasi-constitutional law. We no longer have any apparatus for having that kind of law in the United Kingdom. Now, there's a case to be made that that's a good thing. Why should any law be beyond the reach of the democratic sovereign? But for people who think actually certain minimum long-term standards should be enshrined beyond the whims of day-to-day politics, Brexit creates this problem in that there's absolutely no way of doing so. So you can vote for certain standards, and if Parliament passes that, then they are implemented, but the next Parliament might reverse that vote. So there is nothing long-term and enshrined at a constitutional level. And I think ultimately that will be one of the biggest impacts of Brexit. It's just we've been too busy watching these negotiations to pay much attention to things like that. Can I leave it there? Because I think my voice is about to pack up apart from anything else.
Yes, thank you very much. I'm sure there are many questions. Just building up, I wanted to start off on what you said about regulatory standards and the fact indeed that domestically there is no longer apparatus to kind of adopt, or I mean, there is the Parliament to adopt these regulatory standards, but do you think that this would play in favor of continued convergence with Brussels then in terms of regulatory standards, if you know also the argument of the Brussels effect from Anu Bradford and so on, that this missing part could explain maybe why in the future Parliament would continue to converge on regulatory standards with the EU?
No, not necessarily. I don't think this is the same as the Brussels effect argument, in the sense that this is a political inertia effect. We were in, we're now out, and I just think that political inertia means it's very, very hard for us to change our standards. We might still get divergence in the sense that it's far from a given that if Brussels tightens its standards, it's not necessarily the case that the UK will follow. So I don't think it's like the Brussels effect. But it is the case that, and I think, you need to sort of distinguish between different sorts of sector here as well. My sense is that the UK will be quite innovative in regulatory terms in new sectors, whether it comes to AI or robotics or fintech, sectors where there isn't a large body of pre-existing national or EU regulation. I think we will do things differently. We might find that in financial services as well. But traditional areas of the economy where we already have a lot of EU law, whether it's agriculture or workers' rights or things like that, my argument is simply that there isn't a political coalition powerful enough to take that on.
Okay. So, yeah, thank you very much. Christopher, how can Brexit affect the strategic compass document that is being prepared by the EU? I don't know.
Well, I mean, more broadly, if I can answer your question a bit more broadly than you posed it, in terms of the EU's sort of foreign and security policy ambitions, Brexit weakens the European Union. There's no doubt about that. In military terms, it's quite obvious. In political and diplomatic terms, it's also the case. Yet, the flip side is the EU might find it easier to come to agreement without the UK around the table. That's the trade-off, I think. The operational headquarters that the EU has set up subsequent to Brexit was something that the UK government had been vetoing for quite a long time. I think moving beyond foreign and security policy, the European Recovery Fund would not have passed in its current form had the UK still been a member state of the European Union. So in a sense, the UK loses overall heft because a large member state is no longer around the table, but it might gain a degree of flexibility, though we shouldn't overstate that because God knows there are enough divisions inside the European Union even without the UK, but it might be able to do slightly more than it could when the UK was there and willing to exert a veto.
Yeah, we have two more questions. Deborah, would you like to ask it in person? And then we have Agathe on trust.
Yes, thank you, Professor Menon. I think I heard you at the conference on Tuesday as well, and it was very, I was very impressed, and I must admit your website has some excellent pieces on there. Nothing much on financial services, but very, very good. Do you think that Brexit has actually reduced the respect for the rule of law in the UK? Because is there a real danger now that the UK government is prepared to breach not only international law, but even its own law? And in this case, I'm referring to the move to limit judicial review, of its own legislation in order to achieve what is effectively an expedient solution. And again, Northern Ireland Protocol might be an interesting example of that. So again, have we now seen a process in terms of the legislature here being driven by simply politics and policy without much respect for the legal and, as you say, constitutional relationships?
Well, thank you. Let me say several things in response. Firstly, any or all of you who want to write for our website, please do. I should have said that to start with, but we welcome submissions from early career researchers. So if you've got something that's vaguely related to Brexit and you want to do a blog or something about it, then just get in touch. I think the extreme parallels that you'll see on social media between democratic backsliding in Hungary and democratic backsliding in the UK are massively overdone. This is certainly a government that is willing to sound like it will challenge some of the fundamental tenets of liberal democracy. What government officials will say to you about the internal market bill was it was only ever a threat. They would also argue that it got them what they wanted. We could argue about that. I don't think that's necessarily accurate. But what they will say is we never actually did it, did we? I think they are prepared to play fast and loose with the general principles, absolutely. Whether they're willing to act on those temptations to play fast and loose and actually challenge the rule of law directly is not clear yet, and I suspect not. I suspect even the current Conservative Party has enough people in it who would be deeply queasy about that kind of thing. On the judicial review, yep, they might be. I mean, I don't think this is the same as packing courts in Poland or Hungary. I think sort of tinkering with the scope of judicial review, you might regret it. But again, there's that argument, which is, politics needs to have more scope to do what politics wants to do. There are certainly sort of at the margins, liberal democracy is being tampered with, but I don't think it's anything like what we're seeing in Eastern Europe. The final thing I would say is one of the big limits on this is that, of course, the UK government has set itself up internationally as a great defender of liberal internationalism. Everything about global Britain is premised on Britain as a defender of basic human rights, respect for international law, and so on and so forth. Boris Johnson's made great play of that. Dominic Raab, the Foreign Secretary, has made great play on that. And I think in a way that limits what they can do at home. Is that the UK government is slightly tying itself up with its own rhetoric, because you can't easily do that at home and do different stuff, say that abroad and do different stuff at home. So I think you've got a point, but it's not as significant a point as some make it out to be. Sorry, that was a very rambling answer.
Thank you very much. I see that Agathe and then Ola have questions as well. Agathe.
Yes, thank you very much for this fascinating presentation as usual. So my question was a bit more maybe a reflection about what we've already done during the summer school. We had Philip Rycroft, who came and mentioned the idea that the EU and the UK were becoming more and more distant. We also listened to Tuesday conference, and there was this intervention of Maros Sefcovic, which was quite clear about the trust between the EU and the UK being damaged. So I just wanted to have maybe your view about the current state of the EU-UK relation. Do you think that there's this relation of trust which is really permanently damaged, and how you would assess the current EU-UK relation?
Well, I wouldn't say permanently. I think I might say durably. But yeah, there is an absence of trust between the two sides. And one of the reasons there is an absence of trust between the two sides is, in some respects at least, that suits both sides. We're in a weird situation now where two entities, partners, collaborators, and allies, to some extent have an interest in watching the other side fail. I think, if you're President Macron in France, it would help you electorally next year if Brexit looked like a complete shit show, to use a technical term. You could turn around to Marine Le Pen and you could say, well, look, that's what right-wing populism gets you. So you might be careful what you wish for. And I think in that sense, a certain amount of tension is built into the relationship. This is all the more so from the UK side, because remember what I said, that the Tories have constructed a Leave coalition. It's very, very good politics for Boris Johnson for there to be a significant degree of tension in relations between the UK and the EU. So for the foreseeable future, I don't see it as being overridingly in the interests of either side for that tension to disappear. I do see it as being in the interests of both sides not to wreck the whole deal. So I think they need to find that balancing act where they can sort of snarl and snipe at each other, but without bringing the whole house of cards down. And of course, the danger with that is that's quite a fine judgment call, and you might end up bringing the whole house of cards down if you're not careful.
But isn't that the history of the relationship generally anyway? Because that was very much the sort of, as you say, the snarling and sniping went on for 40 years, and ultimately the decision was taken in the referendum.
Kind of. I mean, I'd say a couple of things about that. Is yes, the tone of British relations with the EU was never great. That was all right under Tony Blair and under Edward Heath. But actually, UK made a lot of significant practical contributions to European integration, whether that be the single market or defence policy, or indeed, the origins of the EU's current environmental ambitions go back to the Hampton Court summit that Tony Blair hosted back in the early 2000s. So the UK at the same time was was making a positive contribution to the European Union as well. I should also say in parentheses that, it wasn't the UK that boycotted the council for a year, making it impossible for any rules to be passed. That was France. And, I think we sometimes forget that the UK wasn't the only sort of difficult or awkward partner that the European Union has had. I mean, the final thing I'd say is I suspect that some of the East European countries are going to make the UK look like a choir boy in the years to come if current trends persist. But now it's far more black and white now, I think. One of the freedoms that the Brexit deal gives the UK government, because the trade and cooperation agreement doesn't cover foreign and security policy, is that we can have tensions with the European Union and continue working quite closely with member states to the extent that member states are willing to do that. For instance, the French were incredibly irritated by the declaration that the UK and Germany signed last week, and by the very warm language that Angela Merkel and Boris Johnson were using towards each other. From the French point of view, it was, hang on a sec, these people are tearing up the bloody protocol we gave them. They're not implementing it in good faith. And you swan over on your kind of retirement tour to London and have a lovely time with them and sign a warm and woolly declaration. So that will be something very interesting to watch. The degree to which a desire on the part of member states to work bilaterally with the United Kingdom cuts across their equally sincerely held desire to maintain EU unity in the face of British annoyances, if you like.
Ola, do you want to go back on the long-term effects of economically as well?
Yeah, so thank you so much for your talk. I was just wondering, do you think it will ever be possible, from a research perspective, to kind of separate the impact of Brexit and the impact of the pandemic on the UK? Or will it always be a case of we don't really know?
I think in
which
10
is
or
more
15,
important?
I think in retrospect, in 10 or 15 years' time, you will probably be able to get some idea by doing that comparatively. If you go to the website of the Centre for European Reform, there's a guy there called John Springford, who has been doing this modelling of trying to understand what the cost of Brexit has been so far. And what he does is he uses what the economists call a doppelganger. So you take a basket of economies that have historically performed like the UK economy has performed. You look at their performance over time and you compare it to the UK's performance over time. And what you find is during membership, they tracked each other very, very closely indeed. As soon as the referendum vote happened, they diverged and the UK went underneath that other line. So his argument is that even now, you know, Brexit has cost the UK economy 3–4% of its GDP in terms of lost investment and things like that. So I think looking back with the historical data, you'll be able to do it, but it'll never be absolutely clear cut.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. There is a question from Angelica from Brazil. Would you like to ask your question?
Yeah, thank you so much for your talk. And I'm curious about the impact of Brexit in Scotland. So I have two questions. The first is related to this increasing support that you mentioned for Scottish independence, and also considering the results.
Oh, sorry.
Okay. And also considering the results of the Scottish election. So which would be the biggest challenge in this process? And the second question is a hypothetical case of Scottish independence and the possible talks for EU accession. So which would be Scotland's status as an independent country, but not yet an EU member?
So you mean what's the biggest problem facing the SNP if it wants the Scots to vote for independence? I suspect, well, firstly, support, according to the polls, has tailed off a little bit. There's a long, long way to go before, I mean, starting with the fact that the Scots can't have a referendum unless the UK government lets them. So it's, you know, it's far from certain we'll have a referendum. Imagine, for instance, at the next general election that the SNP don't do very well because of dissatisfaction with the state of the Scottish economy or the handling of the pandemic or whatever it might be. The political momentum fizzles out. And Nicola Sturgeon is very keen not to go rogue. She wants to go through due process. I mean, a friend of mine in the civil service sort of jokingly said to me tonight that last week that the only people who really don't want a Scottish independence referendum now are Boris Johnson and Nicola Sturgeon. And that, you know, everyone else in the SNP is very, very keen. So getting a referendum will be hard. Winning it will be hard, not least because given how hard Brexit is under the Trade and Cooperation Agreement, if Scotland wants to leave the United Kingdom and wants to join the European Union, there will have to be a border between Scotland and England. And I think that will be quite a hard sell to the Scottish people, to be honest. And it's, you know, one of the great fun things to do is to watch SNP politicians arguing about Scottish independence now and taking exactly the opposite logical position they took when they were arguing against Brexit. So now you hear the odd SNP politician talking about the fact that we can have alternative arrangements for the border between Scotland and England. That means we don't need any infrastructure, which is precisely the sort of stuff that Theresa May's team was saying about Northern Ireland, that the SNP were poo-pooing as total rubbish and fantasy thinking. So people have proven to be remarkably flexible in their political stances with the combination of Brexit and Scottish independence. Equally, Boris Johnson will talk about how much better it is to be in a larger economy and to be together in one entity than it is to split up, which of course also carries a slight whiff of hypocrisy after Brexit. But what will be the issue about, and actually the issue with the European Union will be very, very similar. There are some people who seem to be under the mistaken impression that Scotland will be treated as a special case by the European Union like Northern Ireland was. Scotland will be treated as a special case, absolutely. Every aspirant member state is a special case, and there's a lot of respect for Scotland. I think there's a degree of fondness for Scotland as a political entity in much of the European Union. And even the Spanish government has signaled that as long as independence happens via legal due process, they will have no opposition to Scotland joining. But if the Scots think that they can be, I think it's very important to remind ourselves that the European Union made a massive concession to the UK over Northern Ireland. And the massive concession was a concession that they said they would never make to Theresa May, which is ultimately the UK is now in charge of monitoring the EU's external border when it comes to goods traffic between Great Britain and Northern Ireland. Okay, it's an absolute breach of some of the core principles of the European Union, which of course they've kept quiet because they were willing to make an exception for Northern Ireland. Why were they willing to make an exception for Northern Ireland? For two reasons, I think. One, because Northern Ireland is small, which helped. Okay, so, you know, even the most paranoid French mercantilists can't see Northern Ireland as a serious and significant economic threat. But secondly, and more importantly, because of the constitutional situation in Northern Ireland, because the EU is a signatory to the Good Friday Agreement, because of the threat of a recurrence of sectarian violence, and because the vital national interests of a member state, the Republic, were engaged. None of those conditions hold for Scotland. So I think, you know, the EU would definitely start accession procedures with Scotland, but I don't think they will help them out when it comes to that border. And I think that border would be a key issue in the event of any referendum. Sorry, that was a really long answer.
Thank you very much. I see one more question, and then we're going to wrap up. So there is a question about Gibraltar as a good example of difficulties. I don't know if you have any comments on this special case. And then I think I would like to ask you the question for our PhD students in terms of future research and how to, you know, have relevant research in that field on the future of EU-UK relations. What would be your advice? Your top maybe 3 main areas. I mean, you have already outlined a few, but like where you are lacking research as well, or where research would be needed.
Mm-hmm. Gibraltar is a good example of 2 things, I think. One, the complexity of Brexit, particularly for a state with territories dotted around. The Falklands actually is going to prove massively problematic because of the fisheries deal, but no one's talking about that yet. And the second thing that Gibraltar underlines is just how much the British establishment was unaware of the complexities of its own territory. So little thought went into Gibraltar from the part of the UK government that you ended up with this weird Schengen fudge at the end of it, which no one wanted in the UK government, but which they basically snuck through, hoping that no one in the UK will notice. One of the things we've learned over the course of the last 5 years is just how little the English care about anything else in the United Kingdom, not just Gibraltar, but also Northern Ireland and Scotland. So Gibraltar was an interesting and rather sort of sad case in that sense. I mean, the first thing I would say about research is do what you're interested in. I mean, I think, you know, the danger of doing something because you think it's sexy or it's topical is if it bores you, and actually, if your heart lies somewhere else, you're going to be miserable doing it. So you should always let your research be guided by the things that really interest and excite you first and foremost. In terms of UK-EU relations, I mean, it's an open book, isn't it? I mean, it's a completely blank slate. I mean, one of the things we're thinking about at the moment is whether the European Union's neighbourhood policy needs to be revisited, because it strikes me that that neighbourhood policy was always predicated on the assumption that the EU's neighbours would be a bunch of states that wanted nothing more in life than to have a very close relationship with the European Union. So it's predicated on the assumption that we're surrounded by countries that want to be either like us or in us, you know, part of the European Union. But if you end up in a situation where you have neighbors like increasingly Turkey, but like Switzerland or the United Kingdom that have made clear they don't want, you know, ever closer union, they don't want to move closer and closer to the European Union, does the EU need to start thinking about different models for dealing with that? Otherwise, it ends up with a load of problematic neighbors with whom relations are tense. Maybe that doesn't matter. But I think EU neighbourhood policy and Brexit as an example of it going forward, I think is interesting. I think that whole issue of Europeanisation versus de-Europeanisation is fascinating. I mean, in a sense, everything that has happened since the referendum proves that the Brexiters were right, in the sense that European Union impinges on every single sodding aspect of national life and is far, far more than a trading bloc. You know, it gets into the nooks and crannies of your constitutional and political system to an extent that it is hard to believe. But that being the case, while they were right, they were also wrong, because Brexiters argued that the EU invaded national, political, economic and constitutional life, but they also argued that doing Brexit would be quick and easy.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah. On the neighborhood policy, just very briefly, have you heard or have you seen any awareness amongst EU officials that they need to rethink their neighborhood policy, because this doesn't seem to be at all discussed, I mean, from my perspective. So, and
Absolutely
we have,
not.
yeah.
I mean, I think for two reasons, well, for several reasons. One, because of course, Brexit is viewed as the UK going mad. The EU hasn't started to ponder whether Brexit is the case of an illustration of some kind of broader malaise within the European Union itself, and so that's how they've dealt with it conceptually and intellectually. Secondly, because the people in the, I mean, in a sense, the problem here is structural and institutional. The European Commission isn't very good at thinking strategically or geostrategically. You saw that in the negotiations with Ukraine. The EU carried out these detailed negotiations, the Commission carried out these detailed negotiations over a deep and comprehensive free trade agreement with Ukraine, and kind of forgot that Russia existed, which was a very European Commission thing to do. It was kind of like, here's Ukraine, here's a country on our border, they want closer relations with us, we'll give them this deal, that will be great. And no one thought, but hang on, what will Moscow think about this? And I think that broader geostrategy, I mean, this is why actually member states being sidelined from the Brexit talks was a very good thing to maintain EU unity and arrive at a trade deal that suited the interests of the European Union, but a very bad thing in terms of, hang on a sec, we are partners and we are allies in a world that is increasingly dangerous and uncertain. How the hell do we ensure, above and beyond the EU rulebook, that we can continue to work together and collaborate? That was missing. It was missing on the UK side because of the dysfunctionality of our politics. It was missing from the EU side because national capitals and chancelleries delegated the task of doing those talks to the European Commission.
Very good. Thank you very much. Last question from Deborah. Could you comment on cross-disciplinary research? Deborah is working is a lawyer, and we've been talking a lot about these issues, and whether Brexit is a perfect laboratory for this type of research. So how to improve and increase cross-disciplinary research.
It is, yes. I mean, let me say several things. Firstly, I have never, ever understood why people like the SRC and universities promote interdisciplinary research as an end in its own right. I don't think interdisciplinary research is better or worse than sort of single discipline research. I think where there's a problem that needs many disciplines, that's great. But I think the logic behind the promotion of interdisciplinary research is organizational and financial rather than intellectual, if you see what I mean. But yeah, Brexit is a very good case. I mean, Brexit in a sense is a case of the trade-offs between the social sciences. I remember I gave a talk a few years ago in which I basically said that, you know, Brexit is a case of the law versus economics versus politics. You know, it's a sort of social science trilemma of Brexit, if you like, in that, you know, you can't satisfy your political aspirations while satisfying your economic aspirations while remaining faithful to legal agreements. Yeah. And, you know, Catherine Barnard, who's a member of our team, you might have come across her. She does quite a lot of stuff on the legal aspects of Brexit. She and I have had a long running, friendly, I should say, argument about this, in that my argument has always been, ultimately, politics is going to trump the law, that they will find a way round. You know, if there's a will, there's a way. And her argument has been, actually, law is its own field with its own logic and its own rationale and its own dynamic, and it's somehow autonomous from politics. I think, yes, there's all sorts of good interdisciplinary research that could be done. There's also some good research on the interplay. You know, what is Brexit? Brexit is the triumph of politics over economics. It is, you know, reclaiming independence at the cost of trade. And not even reclaiming independence at the cost of trade, as I argued, so you can regulate your economy more efficiently, because we're not going to be able to do that. It is simply control. I'll give you one example. We ended freedom of movement. Since we ended freedom of movement, the British attitude towards immigration has become significantly more supportive than it was pre-2016. Immigration is no longer a salient fact in British political life, and British attitudes towards immigration are far more positive than they were before 2016. And one of the reasons for that, it's not the only reason, is because what people wanted was the ability to control immigration, not necessarily the ability to cut immigration, but the ability to control it. And that's intensely political. So I think there are all sorts of really fascinating things we can talk about interdisciplinarily as social scientists coming out of Brexit, but it doesn't, I wouldn't feel forced or impelled to do interdisciplinary work just because every single dean in your university says interdisciplinary is good.
Thank you very much. We had the same arguments yesterday about the whether Brexit was a legal issue or it was about politics. We don't have economics in the group, so
okay.
That's a good.
That's always good.
Well, I think you have to go, so we would like to really warmly thank you for being there early this morning after the football match, talking to us. It was an excellent talk, and yeah, at NEXTEUK we are working on this concept of engagement, disengagement, de-Europeanization. So at some point it would be really useful also to have your feedback on that.
And I'm sorry about my voice, but it is because I went to the football last night, and I'm a bit embarrassed to say that my voice is going to pack in soon.
Great. Thank you so much.
Enjoy the rest of your day.
We'll be in touch. Have a good summer, Anand.
All of you too. Take care of yourselves.
Take care. Bye-bye.